So, you've decided to turn your phone into a handheld gaming machine, but you're now faced with the difficult task of picking out a suitable controller with a good set of features. How's it going, everyone? My name is Taki, and in this video, we're going to take a look at the GameSir X3 to see if it's worth the asking price. If you're not new to Android gamepads, this design should be very familiar to you. We essentially have the GameSir X2 with some minor additions, namely the active cooling fan that we have and a slightly wider frame. The back of the X3 is where you're going to find most of the changes, and we're going to go over those in just a moment. The X3's control scheme is essentially the same as it is on a Switch. We have start and select buttons on the top, followed by two separate buttons on the bottom that have different functionality depending on what you're doing. Unlike the Switch, we have two analog sticks with a decent range of motion on them, and you have a set of customizable ABXY buttons and a customizable D-pad. The biggest change this time around, besides the fan, is the fact that you can customize just about anything that you could want on this controller. I've taken apart everything right now so you can get an idea of what it looks like with nothing on. For your analog sticks, you have two different size sticks that you can use, and these are the two sizes that you can pick from. They are attached by a magnet to the controller. The same thing can be said for the ABXY buttons. You can customize the A and the B location and the X and the Y location, and they snap in with a magnet. The D-pad is also connected by magnets, and you have two to choose from for this, but I wouldn't say that either of them are particularly that great. You have this Xbox style one here that I don't really care for that much, and I don't think that I'll ever use it, but they do have a more standardized D-pad if you prefer that instead. I think they should have just straight up gone for the D-pad that they used in the X2 revision and cut the customization for this part. I know a lot of people were hoping that there would be some revision to the shoulder buttons on this controller. Unfortunately, they are largely the same as the older X2. These are Switch-based digital triggers, and even though it seems like we do have enough space in the back for real analog triggers, they didn't add them to this revision. And that's kind of unfortunate because that would have been a standout feature for this product. There are few, if any, good telescope controllers with analog triggers on the market, so this seems like a missed opportunity. One of the things that I liked a lot about the X2 was the grip that they had in the back. It was made out of rubber, but on this new revision, they've basically just molded that into the plastic frame with some dimples to give you some grip. It doesn't have a rubber texture, so the grip isn't as strong as it is on the X2, but the shape and the ergonomics are basically the same, and it works very well. This is one of my favorite grips on the market due to how comfortably it fits inside my hand. You will notice on this controller that there are two USB Type-C ports on the bottom. One of them powers the fan, and the other potentially acts as a pass-through charging port for your phone. If you plug a Type-C cable into the center, you will enable the RGB fan and the active cooling element that they say can drop surface temperatures by over 20 Celsius. The problem with this design is that you obviously need to use two USB cables if you wanted to power the phone and the fan at the same time. You'll notice that I've just plugged in the second USB cable. This will potentially charge your phone through pass-through power delivery. The problem is that it does not work with all phones due to some hardware conflicts in the controller. I tested this out on 5 phones, and only 2 of them were able to do the pass-through power delivery. So I wouldn't take this as a guaranteed feature, and I would check to see which phones the company has specifically tested to work. In my opinion, this design is another missed opportunity. I don't know how many situations you'd be in where you'd have 2 USB cables ready to use as I have here. I would have liked to see something like a central USB port that could power the phone and the fan. They could have made a toggle switch to allow you to power both with limited current going to the phone, or they could have allowed you to disable the fan completely and just power the phone itself. If for whatever reason there would still be issues with pass-through power delivery, they could have made a Bluetooth mode for this controller that could free up the Type-C port for charging. Another thing that I've noticed while using this controller during the time that I've had it is that they've used something slightly different for their input buttons compared to the other controllers in this line that I own. These are not using conductive rubber, and I know a lot of people would have preferred conductive rubber, but they are also not dome switches. These are more like the switches that you'd find in a computer mouse than anything that you'd see in something like the Vita or the Switch. I happen to have an X2 here that I personally use, and I wanted to talk about some of the big differences that I'm seeing between the two controllers. I think right off the bat, you'll notice that the overall shape of the new controller is slightly more ergonomic compared to the squarish version that came before it. You can definitely feel this in the palm of your hand when you're using it. These rounded edges that contour to your hand are a lot better, but we unfortunately do not have those rubber grips. The buttons are another sticking point, and I want to simulate the sound of those. So I'm going to press the buttons on the X2 first so you can hear how they sound. And now let's do the same on the X3. I think the X2 sounds much better. So who is this controller for? Well, there are essentially several things you can do with this. The first one is that you can use it for emulation, and basically any emulator that you want to use will be able to use these controls. But you can also use it for Android games that have native gamepad support, and we'll show off a few of those so you can see how it works. You can also use it for game streaming, but I'm not going to showcase that in this video. And the final use case for this controller is one that used to be the main selling point of this line. You can use it for Switch emulation. Thankfully, things have changed since the time the first controller was released, but we will still talk about that final point in this video. Before moving on, I do want to point out something because this controller does have some slight quirks to it. I know a lot of people would like to be able to keep a case on their phone when they're using something like this to protect it. Unfortunately, that is not an option with this controller unless you were to DIY this. If you try to put your phone with a case attached into this controller, it won't sit deep enough on the end for the Type-C connector to go inside the phone. And I can showcase that right now. As you see, the bottom rubber grip that they have used here gets in the way of the Type-C going in just a bit further. And if it did, then you'd be able to keep a case on this while you're using it. I think that would have made this a lot better in my opinion. I might DIY this myself in the future, but I did want to point it out here that you are going to need to take off your phone case if you want to use this controller. One important point about the fan in this controller is that it's slightly movable. If you take an instance where you will have more heat closer to the left or the right sides of this controller, being able to slightly adjust the fan will result in better cooling efficiency. The phone that I'm using in this video already has active cooling, but it can still benefit from the cooler in this controller. If you do not own a phone with active cooling like the Red Magic 7 here, you'll get even more use out of this external cooler for high-end emulation and demanding Android games because it will help you limit thermal throttling and increase the time that your phone can operate at peak performance. I got asked about this the last time I filmed using this arrangement, so I want to explain that I'm using this angled headphone adapter to get audio out while filming this purely for this video. I would not normally do something like this, and I would instead opt for a set of Bluetooth headphones if I needed them. As I've mentioned, you can use this controller for any Android game that has native gamepad support. There are not as many as I would like, but there are some good ones out there. This controller can use screen mapping software from GameSir to map other Android games, but I do not like using their mapping app, and there are better options on the market for controllers with better support and software. When it comes to emulation, you should be able to use this controller without any fuss in some of the big emulators. PPSSPP worked without me needing to do anything, and RetroArch automatically created a default profile for this controller when I started up the application. For other emulators like Dolphin, you'll need to take a few seconds to map your controls before you can game. Just keep in mind that we do not have analog R2 and L2 on this controller, so you will not be able to feather your input in games that support it like Super Mario Sunshine. As I already mentioned, one of the main selling points of the controller that came before this was the support for the emulator that needs the controller to function. I've already said a lot about this emulator before, so it doesn't bear repeating in this one. If you ignore the fact that you need a ridiculously powerful phone to use it, it is cool being able to play games like Witcher 3 on the go. It's also cool being able to play a proper Diablo game on Android until the fateful day that Blizzard decides to open up Immortal for everyone. The key difference this time around is that there's a free alternative to this app that is making huge strides in compatibility and performance across a large spectrum of devices that eclipses the aforementioned emulator, so this isn't a primary selling point of the X3 anymore. So let's wrap up this video with my pros and cons of the GameSir X3. For pros, the X3 has great ergonomics and excellent build quality. I like that it can support large phones, and I like that it comes with a powerful active cooling fan. The ability to swap out buttons is a neat feature, and I like that I'm able to rearrange my input buttons. I also like that this is a no-fuss, plug-and-play controller. On the con side, I don't like the flaky pass-through power delivery, and I do not like that the switches for the D-pad and ABXY buttons make more noise than they did on the X2. Not having analog triggers on this revision is a strange omission, since it was a highly requested feature over the last year. This controller uses a new mold compared to the X2, so they could have implemented analog triggers if they wanted. It would have helped with product differentiation and the higher barrier to entry. I'm not a fan of the non-standard D-pad, and I don't think it was worth making that part able to be customized by the user if it meant that we were left with a circle D-pad. And as I've already said, I wish this design used a single USB port instead of two, because I think that's a more realistic way of using this controller. This final point is one that I'm not really that sure about, which is why it has a question mark. This has an introductory price of $69, but their website states that it will be $99 once it is mass produced. I can see this being a $60-ish controller based on everything that I've seen here and my knowledge of the component costs, especially when we compare it to other telescope controllers, but I think that $99 puts this in a completely different price range. I hope this settles closer to the introductory price as time goes on, because this is a decent controller, all things included. Anyway, I'm interested to know your thoughts down below. Are you thinking about grabbing the X3? Or are you happy with the X2 or some other controller for your gaming needs? Thanks for taking the time to watch this video. Now go out and enjoy the rest of your day. Taki out.